Hello, this is a brief presentation on John Stuart Mill's little book, Utilitarianism. The book first appears as a series of articles in Fraser's magazine in 1861 and was published in book form in 1863. That should tell us that this book is meant for a wider audience than just academics. It's not a scholarly publication in the sense that we're used to, but rather Mill meant to reach a large audience to try to explain his ethical theories. You'll see in reading it that the book does not deal with profound metaphysical issues, but instead is more interested with our practical reasoning in trying to decide what is the best course of action in any given situation. Mill's meant to provide us with tools for thinking through complicated situations that we find ourselves in the hopes of our being able to do the right thing. The title of the book is also the title of the moral theory, Utilitarianism. It comes from the word utility, which means usefulness. If you think of Batman with his utility belt, well, what's on that belt? All kinds of useful tools that he might find necessary to help him fight crime. Well, okay, so usefulness is what we're interested in Mill's theory, and we have to ask, well, usefulness for what? For Mill, it's for attaining pleasure and avoiding pain, and that's going to be the basis of Mill's ethics, and we'll talk about that as we go along. Now, I understand in this presentation you're going to see a lot of words, and anybody that tells you how to make a good PowerPoint presentation tells you don't be so wordy. Sorry about that. What I'm doing here in this presentation is pulling out some excerpts from the text and trying to read them closely with you, so you could find these same words in your copy of the text, and this will be my way of sort of delving deeply into these a few passages, key passages, to help us understand the text as a whole. So I apologize for the wordiness, but just pretend we have our books open and we're reading this together. Okay, so first question, how do we get started when we're talking about ethics? So here's Mill. The truths which are ultimately accepted as the first principles of a science are really the last results of metaphysical analysis, practiced on the elementary notions with which the science is conversant, or what the science deals with. And their relation to the science is not that of foundations to an edifice, but more like roots to a tree. And the roots of a tree may perform their office, do what they do, equally well, though they be never dug down to and exposed to light. But though in science the particular truths precede the general theory, the contrary might be expected to be the case with a practical art such as morals or legislation. All right, let's just stop for the first half of that paragraph. What's Mill saying here? When we engage in the natural sciences, particular truths, facts, we grasp those first. Take the weather. We look outside and say, oh, look, it's raining today. That's the fact. That's the particular truth. It's raining. What we need now is a theory. Why is it raining? Why does it rain? What makes rain happen? That's what science does. And look, there are reasons why it rains, and those reasons are at work whether we've figured them out or not. As long as there's been rain, those principles that make rain have been doing their job, exercising, performing their office, as Mill would say, whether we take the time to figure out why it rains or not. That's how natural sciences work. But now Mill's going to say it might be different with practical arts such as morals or legislation. And notice he says next, all action is for the sake of some end. Now, you saw that. If you've taken a course with me, you saw that in reading Aristotle. The very first book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics says the exact same thing. All action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. So if we have rules to tell us how to act, well, those rules have to come from the fact that we want things. We have ends, we have aims or goals or purposes, and any rules we formulate ought to be formulated on the basis of helping us get at what we want. So he says, when we engage in a pursuit, a clear and precise conception of what we are pursuing would seem to be the first thing we need instead of the last thing we look forward to. When we get in a car and go on a drive, we have a goal in mind. We want to get someplace. Any map that we pick up and use is going to be determined to be useful or not useful based on whether it can help us get to where it is that we want to go. We don't just drive around and say, oh, I wonder where we're going to end up. I mean, maybe for a fun afternoon on a Saturday, we might do that. Normally we don't. We have an end in mind. There's some place we're headed, and the map or the directions for getting there are completely dependent on where it is that we want to go. We need the goal first, and then we can determine what directions will be helpful. So he says, a test of right and wrong must be the means, one would think, of ascertaining what is right and wrong, and not a consequence of having already ascertained it. So now let's review. Let's look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 4 again, because he talks about how we get started. So this is Aristotle now. Let us not fail to notice, however, that there is a difference between arguments from and those to the first principles. Now, we discussed that earlier when we discussed Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Sometimes we argue towards first principles, sometimes we argue from first principles in determining what to do. For Plato, too, was right in raising this question and asking, as he used to do, are we on the way from or to the first principles? There is a difference, as there is in a race course, between the course from the judges to the turning point and the way back. In a running race, you start at the starting line, you run away from where the judges are who will determine the winner, and then when you get to a certain point, you turn around, you run back towards that same point. That would work on a circular track too. If you're going to run a single lap around a track, you start from a certain point, and at the beginning you're running away from that point. But when you get halfway around the track, you're now running back towards that point. Right? That's the metaphor they're talking about here. For while we must begin with what is known, things are objects of knowledge in two senses, some to us and some without qualification. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, there are certain things we know. That's what it means, known to us. We happen to know them. And there are other things that are known without qualification. What he means by that is knowable things, whether we know them or not. Presumably, then, we must begin with things known to us. Hence, anyone who is to listen intelligently to lectures about what is noble and just, like the Nicomachean Ethics, or perhaps the little book Utilitarianism, and generally, whoever's going to listen about the subject of political science must have been brought up in good habits. Like if you're a vicious, evil person, you're not even going to sit still for an ethics course, a moral foundations course, or contemporary moral problems course. You won't even sit still for a course like that. You have to already be inclined to want to know about what's good, and to be so inclined, you have to be brought up pretty well with some good habits. For the fact is, the starting point, and if this is sufficiently plain to him, he will not at the start need the reason as well. And the man who has been brought up, or the woman who has been brought up well, has or can easily get the starting points. And as for him who neither has nor can get them, let him or her hear the words of Hesiod. Far best is he or she who knows all things himself or herself. Good he or she that hearkens when people counsel right. But he or she who neither knows nor lays heart to another's wisdom is a useless wight. That word wight means like an unfortunate person, unlucky person. Now, okay, what's Aristotle saying here? We have certain starting points in life. We know right and wrong before we become moral theorists or philosophers. We grew up as little kids being trained by our parents or guardians or teachers and so forth to do things like share and to be honest and be polite and things like that. We have a sense of what's good. We start with some things that are called good by those around us, those we think are good. And in order to refine our thoughts, to come to understand the principles at work in those moral facts, we have to already have a starting point for something to think about. Now, if you're a vicious person or an evil person, you won't recognize those things as good, and therefore you will never ask into the foundations or the principles of the goodness of those acts. And the advice Aristotle gives us here is that, look, it's if you want to be good, it's not just enough to be trained. Little puppies and little children are good, but we want to be good in the sense that we know not only what is good and do what is good, but we know why it's good. That we live, that's a form of living with freedom. We're not just trained to robotically do things that other people call good, but we can see for ourselves why things are good. But if we're not at that point, if we're still struggling with that, then Aristotle's advice is find people who do know what's good and listen to their counsel. Take good advice. Find people who seem to be practically wise, who seem to be morally good, and ask them, what's a good thing to do in this situation? And then he complains. He says the person who doesn't know for himself or herself, or who won't listen to another person's counsel, basically is trouble. They're trouble. Okay, so to summarize this, in science, and this one would also include metaphysics, which we have been talking about in this course, we reason from facts to principles. The facts are there, like the tree in this picture. You could see it with your eyes. There's the tree. The leaves are out. The fruit is coming out on the tree, and that happens even if we never figured out that there are any roots. Any little kid that draws a picture of a tree tends to have it just plugged into the dirt because they've perhaps never dug in to the dirt underneath the tree and found the roots. Okay, so the fact that we are here, for instance, requires that there be a first cause, according to Aristotle's metaphysics. Here we are. What accounts for our being here? Well, there must have been something at root, at bottom, in the foundation that got a chain of causality started that resulted in us being here. It rains. That's a fact. We need to, if we want, try to understand why it rains. What are the principles involved? But it's going to rain whether we figure those out or not, and we're here whether we figure out that we have a first cause or not. Now in ethics, I didn't have a good picture, so I decided a bow and arrow is the closest I could get to. We reason from principles to the facts. In this case, let's say the bow is the principles, the rules. So, for instance, if we were studying Immanuel Kant's deontology, the categorical imperative requires that I should honor my promise to repay a debt. So that's the rule. If I find myself having promised to pay a debt, I know then what I should do in that case. I should do everything possible to repay that debt because I promised that I did. So we have to have the rules first in order to know what to do in any given situation. And if we don't have the rules, we take Aristotle's advice. We listen to what smart people, wise people tell us to do. Now, Mill talks about Kant directly in this book, and I have to admit he says what he has to say in a little bit snarky way. Okay, he says, I might go much further and say that to all those a priori moralists, that's Kant, he thought those rules are determined by the reason prior to any experience of the world. You have to know those rules before you could ever even make a moral judgment, according to Kant, as we learned. So Mill says, I'd like to say to all those a priori moralists who deem it necessary to argue at all, right, that's a little snarky. Kant makes arguments all the time in his book, but Mill's trying to say he doesn't. Utilitarian arguments are indispensable even to these a priori moralists. It's not my present purpose to criticize these thinkers. I think, yes, it is. But I cannot help referring for illustration to a systematic treatise by one of the most illustrious of them, The Metaphysics of Ethics by Kant. This remarkable man, whose system of thought will long remain one of the landmarks in the history of philosophical speculation, okay, he's blowing smoke here, does in the treatise in question lay down an universal first principle as the origin and ground of moral obligation. Here it is. So act that the rule on which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings. Right? Act in such a way that your maxim for acting could be willed to be a universal law. That's the way Kant expresses it in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. All right, that's the rule. Now here's Mill. But when Kant begins to deduce from this precept, this rule, any of the actual duties of morality, he fails almost grotesquely to show that there would be any contradiction, any logical, not to say physical impossibility, in the adoption by all rational beings of the most outrageously immoral rules of conduct. All he shows is that the consequences of their universal adoption would be such as no one would choose to incur. Now remember, for Immanuel Kant, the goodness of an act lies in the good will. A good will is your acting in accordance with a conception of the moral law. And that means what matters to morality are your intentions. The intentions with which you act determine whether your act will be moral or not. For Mill, it's just the opposite. It's not the intentions, but the consequences of your act that will make them moral or immoral. And Mill says that Kant says that himself. It just doesn't admit it. For instance, remember what Kant talked about when he says, why you shouldn't lie to get out of a promise. He says, well, think about it. Could you make your maxim, your intention, your reason for acting the way you do, could you make that a universal law like gravity so that everybody would act necessarily on the exact same basis as you? What would it be like if everyone were to always necessarily lie to get out of a promise? Kant's answer is, well, there would be no more promises possible because every word coming out of your mouth would be a lie. Further, there would be no communication possible because the whole basis of communication rests on a foundation of veracity, of truth-telling. If we didn't assume each other to be telling the truth, communication would never even happen. That's the underlying assumption. In fact, that's why a lie can work, because the assumption is you're telling the truth. So if I want to get away with something, I play on that assumption of yours that I'm telling the truth to trick you. All right, so Kant says lying is wrong because if everyone lied all the time necessarily, it would be detrimental to rationality. Well, what's he talking about, asked Mill. He's talking about the consequences of lying. So, deontology, Kant's moral theory, rests on intentions, but Mill, as we see, is going to rest on the consequences. It is a form of consequentialism. The moral theory that what makes an act right or wrong are the consequences that result from that act. Okay. Now, what about proof? What about somebody who asks, well, you're going to give me a moral theory. Why should I accept it? We ask these days when somebody talks about morality, well, who's to say? Why should I believe you? All right, so Mill wants to address this. What are we talking about? We're talking about proof of a moral theory. Well, here's what he has to say. On the present occasion, I shall, without further discussion of the other theories, attempt to contribute something towards the understanding and appreciation of the utilitarian or happiness theory, and towards such proof as it is susceptible of. It is evident that this cannot be proof in the ordinary and popular meaning of the term. Now, what he means by the ordinary popular meaning of the term is maybe what you mean, like prove it beyond any doubt whatsoever. Prove it like a mathematical proof. Prove it like that. Prove it so that you could only reject it on pains of being irrational. Now, here's what Mill says. This is wise, I think. Questions of ultimate ends are not amenable to direct proof. Whatever can be proved to be good must be proved to be good by being shown to be a means to something admitted to be good without proof. Here's some examples. The medical art is proved to be good by its conducing to health. But how is it possible to prove that health is good? Somebody says everybody ought to be healthy. Prove it. Well, what are you going to do about that? Same thing we learned with Aristotle. Everybody wants to be happy. Why? Well, there is no why. There's no proof that that's the case. It's just happiness is desirable for its own sake without any proof. You don't have to prove that to anybody. Another example, the art of music is good for the reason, among others, that it produces pleasure. But what proof is it possible to give that pleasure is good? If somebody says, I don't think pleasure is good, that's the end of the conversation with that person. So, if then it is asserted that there is a comprehensive formula, including all things which are in themselves good, and that whatever else is good is not so as an end, but as a means, the formula may be accepted or rejected, but it is not a subject of what is commonly understood by proof. That's it. I can give you, and this is what Mill's going to do. He's going to give you a comprehensive formula. He's going to say, have a look at it. Test it out. If you like it, you'll accept it. If you don't like it for some reason, well, I guess you'll reject it. But I can't prove to you that you should accept it. I'm going to give it to you and see if you accept it. Now, he quickly notes, we are not, however, to infer that its acceptance or rejection must depend on blind impulse or arbitrary choice. It's not whim whether you accept it or not, because he says there is a larger meaning of the word proof, in which this question is as amenable to it as any other of the disputed questions of philosophy. The subject is within the cognizance of the rational faculty, and neither does that faculty deal with it solely by way of intuition. We're not just sort of guessing whether things are right in philosophy, even though we might not be able to prove them like we would prove a logic problem or a math problem. Considerations may be presented capable of determining the intellect, either to give or withhold its assent to the doctrine, and this is equivalent to proof. Now he says in another book that we're going to read on liberty, he says, there is no such thing as absolute certainty, but there is assurance sufficient for the purposes of human life. We may and must assume our opinion to be true for the guidance of our conduct. Now think about that. Somebody says, well, that's just your opinion. Well, what do you mean by just? Or you say that's a mere opinion. Well, what do you mean in each case when you use the word mere? That's opinion. We live our lives based on our opinions. Our opinions don't come from, cloudy intuitions or just plain fancy or guesswork. Our opinions are those things that, let's say, we can't prove that they're right, but our opinions are formed through living our life, through having a lot of experience, through trial and error, from winning and losing, from feeling pleasure and experience pain. That's where our opinions come from. And Mill's going to give us a theory that refers to that experience we have in life, and he's going to say, look, either this explains sufficiently what's going on, that you can use this as a rule for guiding your behavior, or you'll reject it. I can't prove it any better than that. But that doesn't make it just mere whim that you could just throw it out the window. Our opinions are hard won, and it takes work to get each of us, as we know, to change our opinions. They're opinions. They're not proved like a math problem, but that doesn't mean we could just toss them out the window whenever we want. So he finishes this by saying, it is assuming no more when we forbid bad men to pervert society by the propagation of opinions which we regard as false or pernicious. If you say, take any sort of controversial behavior, some adult that likes to have sex with children, they say, well, you shouldn't do that. The person will say, well, that's your opinion. My opinion is okay. That doesn't stop us from stopping that person, and it ought not to stop us. All right? Our opinions are hard won, even though we can't prove to that person by some mathematical means that his behavior is not good. It's not good. We know it to the extent that we know a lot in life, and that is by opinion. Now let's get into it. The principle of utility itself. The creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, which we learned earlier means usefulness, or the greatest happiness principle, that's going to be a synonym, holds, and here's the whole theory right here, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. There's the definition. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. That's it. Now, we know right away that Mill and Aristotle have something in common here, don't they? Both Aristotle and Mill think that happiness is the goal of life. But where they differ is that happiness for Aristotle does not mean pleasure. He's very specific about this. A happy life will have lots of pleasures in it, but they're not identical. If you only sought pleasure and sought to avoid pain, chances are you might end up unhappy. Because happiness for Aristotle means the complete fulfillment of what it means to be a human person. Mill, on the other hand, has a much thinner definition of happiness. It just means pleasure and the absence of pain. So they're similar in the sense that they both think happiness is the goal of morality. They differ, though, on their definition of happiness. But both of them differ from Kant, who thinks that happiness is not the point of morality, that pursuing your happiness could often lead you to do immoral things, and that the whole foundation of morality is in your will, in the good will, the only good in itself, said Immanuel Kant. So both Aristotle and Mill are different from Kant. Aristotle and Mill think happiness is the goal of morality. Kant disagrees vehemently with that. Aristotle and Mill disagree on the definition of happiness. But one more interesting point, Mill and Kant agree completely on the definition of happiness. Mill and Kant think happiness equals pleasure in the absence of pain. They completely agree with that. Mill thinks that's what we need to know in order to know what's right and wrong. Kant says that's what you have to ignore in order to figure out what's right and wrong. Okay, so to continue, to give a clear view of the moral standards set up by the theory, much more requires to be said. He's going to say it, in particular, what things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. But these supplementary explanations do not affect the theory of life on which the theory of morality is grounded. Right, the theory, as we learned, any theory is to help us see something, help us understand something. So we want to understand how actions are right or wrong. And Mill says that theory is grounded on a prior theory, a theory of life. Again, a theory to help us understand what life is all about. And here's what Mill says life is all about. Pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. And that all desirable things, which are as numerous in this utilitarian theory as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. All he's saying is, look, at bottom, in the end, when you get right down to it, all we really want, all life is about, is seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And the stuff we like, we pursue because it's pleasurable, or we think it'll lead to pleasure in the long run. So I might go to the dentist, even though I don't think it's pleasurable, because I think having healthy teeth is pleasurable in the long run. That's why I decide to do anything, to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. Now you can ask yourself, is that what life is all about? Is that an adequate theory of life? Does that pronouncement that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, does that help us understand human life? Yes or no? You think about it. Now, Jeremy Bentham was John Stuart Mill's teacher, friend of Mill's father, and also a utilitarian in terms of moral theory. And I think it's important to note what Mill does in his book. Mill quotes his teacher. He says, my teacher, Jeremy Bentham, says, pushpin is as good as poetry. Now, pushpin's a little game played in parlors. We don't have parlors anymore, and we don't play games like that. We play Grand Theft Auto or whatever on the video games. Pushpin is a simple little game. You have your pins, I have my pins. We put them on the table. We push our pins around. If my pins land on top of yours, I get to keep your pins. If yours land on top of mine, you get to keep my pins. Fun game, I guess. And what Mill's saying is, Bentham, his teacher, says when it comes to pleasures, one's as good as another. Pushpin, a simple little game, is as good as Shakespeare's poetry. Now, what philosophers and artists and writers have a tendency to worry about is whether they're being unduly influenced by others. In other words, artists and thinkers tend to want to be originals. And so a lot of times what happens is one thinker will criticize another thinker, but they'll do it in an unfair way. They'll say, oh, well, I'm different from that guy. But then when you hear the theory, you say, well, that's exactly the same theory. Mill's doing that here. I don't think Mill and Bentham really disagree, although Mill says in his book that he disagrees. So here's what Jeremy Bentham says. Okay, the utility, the usefulness for seeking pleasure of all the arts and sciences. I speak those of amusement, like entertainment, and curiosity, he means science. The value which they possess is exactly in proportion to the pleasure they yield. So that sounds like they're all equal. And that's where Mill stops thinking about this. Every other species of preeminence which may be attempted to be established among them is altogether fanciful. Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. Now, here's what Mill skipped. If the game of pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either. If poetry and music deserve to be preferred before a game of pushpin, it must be because they are calculated to gratify those individuals who are most difficult to be pleased. So little kids or simple people like pushpin, more mature people, people with wider interests and more education, they're not going to be entertained for very long with pushpin. They're going to want something meteor, so to speak. And that's exactly what Mill is going to talk about in his book. So I bring this up just to say, be on guard for this. Philosophers say, look how I disagree from these other philosophers. Sometimes they really don't. They're just trying to make themselves look different. And here's a good example of Mill doing that. But it raises the important question, is it just the quantity of pleasures? We're trying the principle of utility says maximize happiness, maximize pleasure. That's a even simpler version of the formula. Maximize pleasure. Is it just about quantity, or do we need to figure out a way to understand and take into account the quality of pleasures? So Mill's response, even though he's misunderstood him, he goes, so if I am asked what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that's a weird sentence there, I'll come back to that, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. All right. He's saying, look, if you got two pleasures, your pushpin and poetry, you have to ask people who are competently acquainted with both, not who just have a simple experience of both, like maybe one time I played pushpin, or take a more contemporary example. What's more important, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, or any episode of South Park, the animated show? Well, if somebody says, well, I watched South Park once, it was like little kids swearing in badly drawn animation, I don't get it, but Shakespeare is wonderful and the language is amazing. Mill's not even talking about that. Mill's talking about somebody who really watches South Park, really understands that it's social commentary, and really understands Shakespeare. Didn't just see it once, isn't just liking it because they think they're supposed to like it, but really has come to understand how Shakespeare created his plays and the way he used language and so forth. That person is the one who's able to say, well, yeah, it takes more to get into Shakespeare, but it's more worth it. It's the higher pleasure. Now, it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. That's it. Right? It's our higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of the beast's pleasures. Look, I look at my cats. They lie around in a sunspot. They look perfectly happy. They have no anxieties. They're not paying taxes. They're not worried about where their next meal is coming from. And I think, wow, look at the pleasure that those cats have. They have a simple life. I envy them for like a second. And I think, well, I wouldn't trade if you're able to wave a magic wand and say, would you like to be a cat? There's no possible way. I mean, maybe for a few seconds, as long as you promise to bring me back, because cats can't do all the kinds of things that I can do. So Mill continues, no intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. That's a bold claim. We see bad people prospering, and we say, why? Why? We get jealous. But would we really consent to be bad just to have their pleasures in life? I think most of us wouldn't. Okay? They would not resign what they possess more than he for the most complete satisfaction of all the desires which they have in common with him. If they ever fancied they would, it is only in case of unhappiness so extreme that to escape from it, they would exchange their lot for almost any other, however undesirable in their own eyes. What's that last sentence mean? So look, sometimes life gets so hard, so difficult for some people that they lose hope, they lose perspective. And they would, if possible, accept the deal to be changed into a cat, but we don't get that deal. So what do? Well, the only way to change their life is to end their life, and it's a terrible tragedy. And it's for these people who've lost hope and lost perspective, and we know they shouldn't, but sometimes they feel like that. A being of higher faculty, Mill continues, requires more to make him happy, right? The more demanding you are, the more it takes to make you happy. Is capable, these people of higher faculties, capable probably of more acute suffering. Yeah, kids don't see the problems of the world. Adults do, but you don't really want to be a kid all your life. There's great possibilities, potentialities for maturing adults. That okay, they don't suffer as much as we do, but they don't get as much out of life as we can as mature adults, and it's certainly the pain of life accessible to it at more points than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he or she can never really wish to sink into what he or she feels to be a lower grade of existence. We may give what explanation we please of this unwillingness. We say, why won't we do it? Well, we may attribute it to pride, a name which is given indiscriminately to some of the most and to some of the least estimable feelings which mankind are capable. Pride makes us do great things. Pride makes us do horrible things. We may refer to our unwillingness to trade places to the love of liberty and personal independence, an appeal to which was with the Stoics one of the most effective means for the inculcation of liberty, to the love of power, to the love of excitement, both of which do really enter into and contribute to our unwillingness to change. But its most appropriate appellation, its most appropriate name, is a sense of dignity. Why won't we change places with a cat or a rogue? Our own dignity, which all human beings possess in one form or other, and in some, though by no means in exact proportion to their higher faculties. And he means reason and aesthetic sensibilities, and which is so essential a part of the happiness of those in whom it is strong that nothing which conflicts with it could be otherwise than momentarily an object of desire to them. Whoever supposes that this preference takes place at a sacrifice of happiness, in other words, that the superior being in anything like equal circumstances is not happier than the inferior, confounds two very different ideas of happiness and content. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied, and a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he or she can look for, as this world is constituted, is going to be imperfect. But he or she can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him or her envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. And here, this would be a good tattoo. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison, Socrates and the human being, they know both sides. Now, that's a strong endorsement of what higher pleasures, higher qualities mean in human beings. That, yeah, because we have them, we see problems. We make problems for ourselves, but we wouldn't change places with what we call the lower animals. Now, Mill goes on to say, well, the people who can determine this, the people of the higher faculties, are the competent judges. And he says, from this verdict of the only competent judges, of which two pleasures is better, Mill says, I apprehend there could be no appeal. On a question of which is the best worth having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings, apart from its moral attributes and from its consequences. I'm not sure why he put that parenthetical remark in there, but I'll get back to that. The judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. And there needs be the less hesitation to accept this judgment respecting the quality of pleasures, since there is no other tribunal to be referred to, even on the question of quantity. Well, we always ask who's to say. Who's to say which pleasure is best? Who's to say what kind of life is best? Mill's answer, competent judges. And what if competent judges disagree amongst themselves, people who truly have experience of two pleasures under consideration? He says, well, it's the majority. So that's it then. Even the minority members of the competent judges turn out to be wrong if they prefer something that the majority doesn't. Yes, Mill says. Well, I don't like it, you say. Mill says, well, where else are you going to go to get it decided? That's all we have. There's no other court of appeal. There's nobody else we can ask. There's just us here. And you try to get people with the most experience to make the decisions about what courses of life to pursue, and the majority is probably about the best answer we're going to have as to what's the best thing to do. Now you say, well, that sounds elitist. He says, well, think about it. The standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness. Remember, that's not what they're judging, not what makes me most pleased, but what creates the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure altogether. And if it may possibly be doubted whether a noble character is always the happier for its nobleness. Like, in other words, if I'm noble, maybe I've done something right that actually requires a self-sacrifice. So I might not be happier. But Mill says there could be no doubt that if I do something noble, it makes other people happier, more people happier, and that the world in general is immensely a gainer by my acting noble. Utilitarianism, therefore, could only attain its true end by the general cultivation of nobleness of character. What's the point? Education. Get people, as many people, all the people, as much experience of as many things as possible, and collectively we will be able to decide better what's best for all of us as a whole. Now let's take one final example of utilitarianism at work, a very important example about lying. When we studied Immanuel Kant, we learned that he thinks there is never, ever a reason to lie, that lying is always morally wrong because it's detrimental to the nature of rationality itself. It's self-contradictory. It violates the categorical imperative. Well, here's what Mill has to say. Again, utility is often summarily stigmatized as an immoral doctrine, that's what Kant would call it, by giving it the name of expediency. Now, expediency means, in general, it means to do something that gets you what you want, regardless of the way you get there. So a doctrine can be immoral because, well, yeah, it got me pleasure, but I did it by stepping on people to get there. Right? That's expedient. I broke the rules to get what I wanted to get. Okay, so sometimes people call utilitarianism expedient, and taking advantage of the popular use of that term to contrast it with principle. People who act on principle say, well, I wanted something, but I wasn't able to get it because the only means I had, moral means I had of attaining it, were not sufficient to attain it. So, like Kant would say, I had the right intention, I tried to do the right thing, but I wasn't able to get it. The expedient person might say, I'm getting it. I don't care how I get it, but I'm getting it because it's a good thing. Now here's Mill again. But the expedient in the sense in which it is opposed to the right or principle generally means that which is expedient for the particular interest of the agent himself. For example, when a government minister sacrifices the interest of his country to keep himself in office. When it means anything better than this, it means that which is expedient for some immediate object, some temporary purpose, but which violates a rule whose observance is expedient in a much higher degree. Okay, so there's two versions of expedient. The expedient in this sense, instead of being the same thing as the useful, is actually a branch of the hurtful. In other words, if you do something for your own self-interest, for a temporary gain, that violates some way of doing things that's good for all of us in the long run, you're not really being expedient as you think you are. You're actually being hurtful. So here's an example now to illustrate. Thus, it would often be expedient, for the purpose of getting over some momentary embarrassment or attaining some object immediately useful to ourselves or others, to tell a lie. Isn't it? Sometimes we feel like, well, it'd be real useful to not have to say the truth right here and just come out with a lie. When my wife says, do these pants make me look fat? And if they did for some reason, they probably wouldn't. But if they did, would I want to say yes? Or say, no, the pants don't make you look fat, your fat makes you look fat? I mean, do I want to speak the truth? And well, sometimes I say, no, honey, it's okay. That's the kind of thing Mill's talking about, whether that's right or wrong. He says, but inasmuch as the cultivation in ourselves of a sensitive feeling on the subject of veracity or truth-telling, in other words, we want to be very sensitive to how important truth-telling is, that sensitivity is one of the most useful, and weakening the enfeeblement of that feeling of its importance, one of the most hurtful things to which our conduct can be instrumental. And inasmuch as any, even unintentional deviation from truth does that much towards weakening the trustworthiness of human assertion, which is not only the principal support of all present social well-being, but the insufficiency of truth-telling, which does more than any one thing that can be named to keep back civilization, virtue, and everything on which human happiness on the largest scale depends. We feel that the violation for a present advantage of a rule of such transcendent expediency is not expedient, and that he who, for the sake of a convenience to himself or to some individual, does what depends on him to deprive humankind of the good and inflict upon him evil involved in the greater or less reliance which they can place in each other's word, acts the part of one of their worst enemies. Now, if you need a stronger statement of the importance of truth-telling, I don't know where you'd find it. This is about as strong as it gets. What is he saying here? Look, truth-telling, veracity, is the cornerstone of our human interactions. To do anything to weaken our trust in each other is detrimental to humankind, detrimental to civilization, detrimental to virtue. Lying is bad because the most important expedient we have is to be truthful with each other, is what he's saying. Right? And he says, look, even an inadvertent, unintentional deviation could cause trouble. You know, even if you try your best to tell the truth, but because you are misinformed, you give somebody wrong facts, and those wrong facts are acted upon that person, and bad things come to them, your relationship with that person is going to be in trouble, because they'll say, well, what else are they lying about, or what else are they wrong about? Truth-telling is transcendently important. Okay, so the slide before this says, sometimes it seems expedient to tell a lie. This slide says, yeah, it might seem expedient, but the most important expedient is truth-telling. But listen to how he continues. Yet, that even this rule, sacred as it is, admits of possible exception, is acknowledged by all moralists, maybe all of them except Kant, the chief of which is when the withholding of some fact, as of information from a malefactor, or of bad news from a person dangerously ill, would preserve someone, especially a person other than oneself, from great and unmerited evil, and when the withholding can only be effected by denial. All right, Mill says, lying is bad. Telling the truth is the most expedient thing for the preservation of society. However, there are exceptions. Under what conditions? The first part of this paragraph gives us the conditions. 1, right, the withholding of some fact, of some truth, would preserve a person, not yourself, somebody else, from unmerited evil. Okay, somebody comes into attack a class looking for a certain student, and the student's sitting right there. And the attacker says, where's that student? Well, I'm going to protect that student by saying, I don't know. The student left. They were never here today. I would lie. Why? Because it protects that student from an unmerited evil. Or maybe somebody's really sick, like my grandmother's really ill, and she has a cat, and I'm looking after the cat. Well, while she's ill and while she's in the hospital and trying to recover, any kind of bad news would be detrimental to recovery. But something happened to the cat. The cat got sick. The cat died. I go in to visit my grandmother. She says, how's the cat? I say, what? I say, she's fine, Grandma. Don't worry about the cat. Just get yourself better. Right? I tried to withhold some information from somebody who would suffer if they had that information needlessly. Okay? And I withheld it the only way I could. So Grandma says, how's the cat? And I go, hey, how about the weather? How about them Phillies? She knows I'm changing the subject. She knows I'm trying to withhold the information that makes her nervous. The only way I can withhold the information from her is tell her the opposite. Cat's fine. That puts an end to that conversation. We could move on to her recovery. Okay? So those are the criteria. Withholding information can save someone from unmerited evil, someone other than you from unmerited evil. And 2, the only way to withhold the information is to lie about it. Under those circumstances, maybe a lie is okay. But here's what he says. But in order that the exception may not extend itself beyond the need, like in other words, you start saying, well, it worked this time, maybe it'll work next time. That's what Kant always worried about. And in order that it may have the least possible effect on weakening reliance on veracity, you don't want to be thought to be a liar, it ought to be recognized. And if possible, its limits, to this exception, the limits of the exception, be defined. And he says, if the principle of utility is good for anything, it must be good for weighing those conflicting utilities against one another and marking out the region within which one or the other preponderates. What he's saying is, use that greatest happiness for the greatest number. If does telling the lie, given those two criteria, that you're trying to save somebody from unmerited evil, and the only way you can do that is to lie, is this the case? Is this a good time to use that? You can ask, would it create the greatest happiness for the greatest number? Not just for you, not just even for one person, but overall, would it contribute more to happiness or not? Now, here's a contrary view. This is from a person named Edward Feser. He would describe himself as a conservative Catholic, as you'll see, and he has a problem with utilitarian views in general. So here's Edward Feser. From the point of view of classical natural law theory, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, lying is always intrinsically wrong. For as Aquinas argues, it is directly contrary to the natural end of our communicative faculties, which is to convey what is really on our minds. Mill would say that's the chief expedience of veracity, saying the truth. These days, the view that lying is inherently wrong is often considered eccentric or even mad. But historically it's not uncommon. One finds it in Aristotle, for example, and in Kant. And while I would not go so far as to say that no rational person could doubt it, that's what Kant tried to argue, I, Edward Feser, would suggest that it is only in a culture as morally and intellectually rotted out as ours is by anti-essentialist and consequentialist thinking that it could seem, as it does to many people today, too bizarre to take seriously. Historically, most cultures have understood that what is good for us in some way is in some way determined by the ends nature has set for our various capacities, and accordingly that some things are intrinsically wrong because they are contrary to those ends. And that is why the view that lying is inherently immoral is historically not uncommon. While there have always been those who doubt it, most people historically could at least understand why lying might seem to be inherently bad. Feser's trying to say, he's talking about us. He's trying to say we don't believe that lying is inherently wrong. We tend to be pragmatic about it. If lying helps us get what we want, then it's okay. If lying causes problems, then it's not okay. Even if we tend to think most of the time it's not okay, we tend to think some of the times it is okay. And Mill seems to be saying that. In other words, maybe we're all a bit utilitarian, that there are exceptions to this sacred rule against lying. And Feser's trying to say that's only because we live in a culture that's rotted out by anti-essentialist. That means that we don't think things have an essence, we don't think things have a nature or final causes, and consequentialist. In other words, we only care about the outcome, we only care about the consequences, like utilitarianism. And that rots out our culture, according to Feser. Here's some more Feser. The aftermath of Fat Man's explosion over Nagasaki. Fat Man is the name of an atomic bomb. The aftermath is a fitting symbol for consequentialism. Perhaps consequentialists or utilitarian ethicists should consider putting it on the covers of their books, or wear little mushroom cloud pins where they meet up at philosophical conferences. He's being snarky. For one thing, since the consequentialist case for the bombings, that they would save more lives than an invasion of Japan would, carried the day with the Truman administration and with the defenders of the bombings ever since. It may be the most consequential piece of consequentialist reasoning ever formulated. For another, the bombings give a pretty good idea of what a world consistently run on consequentialist principles might look like. And what's he talking about? Why did they drop the atomic bomb? The argument was, look, if you drop the atomic bomb on a population center of men, women, and children, it's going to kill a lot of people today, but it'll end the war today. And that will save a war going on for 5 years or 10 years, and maybe in the long run save more lives for the soldiers who would have to fight those wars for all those years if you drop the bomb today. So look at the consequences. Dropping the bomb, okay, that's bad, but it would be worse if you let the war go on, so that's why we're going to drop the bomb. And he says, all right, that's a consequentialist piece of reasoning. Now, Feser continues, it's only fair to acknowledge that many consequentialists would no doubt also condemn the bombings, arguing that the better consequences would result overall in the long run from respect for a rule that forbade such actions. All right, so again, a consequentialist would say, hold on, you don't have enough data. Now, yes, if you drop the bomb, you'll kill a lot of people, 100,000 plus people today. But the war will end. So the war won't go on for 5 or 10 years, so you would save 300,000 or 500,000 lives. On the other hand, you're going to start an arms race, a nuclear arms race, because now there's been an atomic bomb dropped. Maybe there'll be another and another and another. We'll live in fear. It'll ruin the world. So all things considered, the consequences would be worse if you drop the bomb today than if you don't. So consequentialist thinking could argue that we should drop the bomb or we shouldn't drop the bomb. Here's Feser's response to this. Whatever. He's saying that like, teenage kids say whatever when they're tired of listening to their parents. Whatever. What matters is that any consequentialist must allow that is at least in principle legitimate intentionally to kill the innocent for the sake of a greater good. That's it. Even if in this case you say don't kill the innocent because it would have worse consequences than if you did, in principle, the consequentialist or utilitarian would still have to accept that maybe if the calculation came out different, I would drop the bomb. I would kill innocent people. Okay? And from the point of view of us reactionary, bigoted, unprogressive, natural law theorists, he's making fun of himself, and Catholics, that is enough to make consequentialism a depraved doctrine. For it is never, never permissible to do what is intrinsically evil that good may come. Not even if you'd feel much happier if you did it. Not even if you got some deeply ingrained tendency to want to do it. Not even if it will shorten a war and save thousands of lives. Never. Okay, I presented Feser's objections to utilitarianism. Give you something to think about. In summary, the utilitarian theory of morality is the principle of utility. Act to attain the greatest happiness, which means pleasure, for the greatest number, and not just for yourself or your friends. It's based on a theory of life that says that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only ultimately desirable ends or aims. Pleasure can differ in quality as well as in quantity, and highest quality pertains to the highest faculties in humans. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Pleasure is determined in the final analysis by competent judges, those who with experience in all activities under consideration. So the goal is for all of us to become competent judges in order that the greatest happiness for the greatest number would ensue. There's two senses of expediency. A, the short term for the person acting, and B, long term for the good of humanity. And Mill's point is that expediency does not have to oppose principle in sense B, because, as he said, it's transcendently expedient to be very sensitive about the importance of telling the truth. And on lying, he says, well, even though it's sacred, this underlying principle of veracity, it's permissible as a last resort to lie if criteria are met. A, the withholding of information would save someone else from unmerited evil or pain. He doesn't say anything about if you deserve the evil or pain because of your actions. And B, withholding can only be done by lying. The principle of utility, he says, can be used to determine if the criteria are met and whether this is a legitimate exception or not. And we've already pointed out some problems. Twice I gave you in these passages when Mill said something like, we might have moral obligations to prefer certain pleasures beyond which one produces the greatest pleasures. I'm not sure what that could mean. If the moral theory that he's presenting us with is to try to help us determine which pleasures to prefer, what could this little phrase that mean, that we might have moral obligations to prefer one that we don't prefer the most? I don't know what that means. It's a confusion for the theory. It's almost like he thinks he has an intuition of something even deeper than utility going on. But then that would undo the utilitarian theory. The second problem is, can there be desirable goals that are attained by immoral means? In other words, if we're really trying to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number, what about the classic case of the perfectly healthy person who's let's call him a universal organ donor, and I have 5 people in desperate need of an organ. Why don't I harvest the organs from the one universal donor who happens to be healthy and give them to the 5 sick people? Okay, that the universal donor will be unhappy and dead, and his family or her family will be unhappy, but the five patients and their families will be happier. So greatest happiness for greatest number says harvest the organs from the healthy person. Is that right? Doesn't that seem immoral? We can ask. And then finally, can utilitarian principle drive us to acts that contradict our own integrity as persons? In other words, am I being asked too much sometimes by always having to consider the greatest good for the greatest number? Does that make me, in effect, sort of just another number, a number in a system? Is that all we are as human persons? So those are three problems, at least that I can recognize in thinking about Mill's moral theory. All right, that's our reading of John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism.